keep them in the light instead of in the dark about what is going on with their pet, include them in it.
Welcome to Talking About Kids. I am your host, R. Bradley Snyder, researcher, activist, and author of The 5 Simple Truths of Raising Kids. I doubt that anyone listening to this needs science to tell them that kids form deep attachments to their pets. However, it is worth noting the research on kids' emotional reactions to a pet's death. Studies show that a pet's death may be traumatic for children and associated with subsequent mental health difficulties. A mitigating factor may be bereavement or how kids are allowed to process that death. My guest today to explore this topic is licensed mental health counselor and animal lover Anne Marie Farage-Smith. Anne Marie shares some practical tips for supporting children from her newly released book, Healing Wisdom for Pet Loss, An Animal Lover's Guide to Grief. This episode is sponsored in part by the Arizona Department of Health Services Must Stop Bullying campaign through its Title V Maternal and Child Health Program. For more information, go to muststopbullying.org. Talking About Kids is designed to help parents, teachers, and other professionals help kids. If you enjoy this episode, please give it a positive review and share it with your friends and colleagues. And now, the interview.
I love I love animals, always have, care about them, advocate for them, know how important they are to other individuals as well. And I began to read a lot more about pet loss and understand it and feel like I don't think it's really being honored in our society.
Hmm.
And people are afraid to talk about it because people will say, "Well, I thought you lost your dog or your cat 3 weeks ago. What's going on?" It was just a dog or a cat, and the person feels ashamed. So I want to take that shame out of there. I want to get people to understand what this loss is all about, and the importance of grieving for this loss, just like any other loss. So that's why so I just have a passion for it.
Yeah, I want to discuss, or I want to begin our discussion with something that you, I believe, begin your book with. Your book being "Healing Wisdom for Pet Loss: An Animal Lover's Guide to Grief," which is you talk a little bit about the benefits of that human and pet bond. What are those benefits?
Oh, they're huge. You can start out with they bring structure to our life. They bring unconditional love, and even more importantly, they bring a pure, non-judgmental love. They don't judge us.
Mm,
They just want us to be with them. They want us to take care of them, obviously, and so that's kind of like the general benefit. They can be a companion for us. They can help us through the stressful times in our life by just being there, and providing the physical comfort of petting them. There's a book out called Made for Each Other, and it's about how even just petting our pet, it produces the good endorphins in our bodies. So it helps with stress relief. So there's just huge amount of benefits. It helps to reduce our blood pressure.
hmm
Now, if you're taking blood pressure medicine, don't stop, even though you got a dog and you're petting them. But it certainly will help and enhance probably the effects of it.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you kind of set that foundation in your book because I think it goes to that other point that you raised about how we expect people to get over the loss of a pet so quickly. But by establishing how important they are, not just as companions, but as you point out in the book, to our mental health and to our physical health, I think you do a nice job of building the case where grieving is allowed or should be allowed and even expected, right?
And you really should not feel shame for grieving because there is no timeline for grief. I mean, it's simply as simple as that. Everybody grieves differently. It's about respecting what each other's grief journey is. It might take you years. It may, it's something that ebbs and flows. It's not just like, okay, now it's 5 weeks went by. I should be better. Um, don't put that judgment on yourself. And let's not do that as a society, put that on somebody else where, hey, you should be over this by now. And you can't replace the pet you lost because
Mm,
sometimes you hear that. Sometimes you hear, well, you can just get another one. Well, sure, you can go out and get another one. That'd be great. Help the adoption um, of the pet. But that's not going to replace the one that you lost because they are unique. Um, that's a unique relationship you had. You can't,
mhm.
replicate that. It's the next pet you have is going to be completely different, and you go with that.
I want to talk some more about grief before kind of getting into those descriptions or even those tips or tricks for helping a child deal with the loss of a pet. Because I think that a lot of us are stuck in what I will call, for the lack of a better term, a classic sense of grief. And I'm thinking specifically of what we learned from Kubler Ross and her description of the kind of those classic stages of grieving. But in your book, you present many other paradigms, many other ways of understanding grieving. Can you explain briefly what you think and what we now believe Kubler Ross got right, and where there are other or different ways to think about the grieving process?
Well, I don't think the thing with the Keebler Ross stages, they are not, grief doesn't go in those neat little, okay, now I'm in the acceptance stage.
Mm,
Now I'm in the denial stage. Now I'm in the angry stage, whatever. Um, it doesn't flow along like that because, like I said, everybody's grief is different. And you may never even experience some of those other quote unquote stages. Um, so it's best to just kind of use those as a gauge. I basically expanded on it, and I've talked about your reactions, the kind of reactions you might encounter as you grieve the loss of your pet. So I go through and I talk about reactions of denial. So this may manifest as, you're feeling numb, you're feeling shocked, you're in dismay. You can't wrap your head around this. It's
mm,
like, oh my God, how did my beautiful, cherished pet really die? How can this be happening? And then I talk about reactions of anger. You may be really angry at the vet who cared for your pet, angry that maybe he couldn't cure your pet.
mm,
I can't believe this is really happening. I can't believe it. Why does anybody understand why I'm hurting so much? My pet was my best friend.
mm,
Reactions of bargaining. Okay, maybe we can make a deal. I will do this if my pet gets better.
mm,
This may be a time when you think of a lot of if the only days and what if days. If only we've taken our pet to the vet sooner. If only we had had that surgery or test for our pet. What if I had gone to a different vet who was a specialist? And then your reactions of depression. You can feel overwhelming sadness and emptiness. It may be difficult to go about your daily activities. You may experience poor appetite, sleep disturbances, difficulty concentrating. These are normal reactions to a loss,
mm,
reactions of acceptance. After some time, you will begin to feel that things will be okay. You may never stop missing your beloved pet, but you feel ready to move on. Moving on does not mean that you will ever forget your pet
right.
or the special relationship you had together. Moving on means your pet will live on forever in your heart. So that's using Kuber's stages of grief in a little different framework.
Right.
And then there's a gentleman called William Warden. Now, he was a psychologist many, many years ago, and he came up with a framework for grief, actually in 2009, wasn't that long ago.
Hmm.
And he breaks it down into Warden's tasks. It's, we have to, the first task is we have to accept the reality of the loss.
Okay.
So you already know intellectually in your head that your pet died, but you may experience still a sense of disbelief. So you have to integrate the reality of their death, taking it in with your whole being.
Mm.
So then many weeks, months, or years later, when an occasion arises that they would have been a part of, the reality again hits you. And then he goes on to the second task of grieving would be to process the pain of the grief. You can experience this pain of grief emotionally, cognitively, physically, behaviorally, and even spiritually. So people may be saying, get over it, move
Mm.
on, be strong. So, in contrast, one of the aims of grief support groups is to encourage and facilitate the safe expression of all the natural grief reactions. And your grief can be felt in all parts of your being. Like I just mentioned, if you can feel it physically, you could be having stomach aches, you could
Hmm.
be having headaches, you could be not getting much sleep. So you need the time to grieve and accept this. And then you move on to the next task, which is to adjust to the world without your pet.
Right.
And that's a big one. You have to make a lot of adjustments to adapt to your new identity. You're not a pet parent anymore. Um, you don't have your companion with you, and your life will never be the same. You can never get used to it, but somehow you manage to move forward, knowing that there may be difficult days ahead as you continue to mourn, and then there'll be the days when things seem a little easier. And then the fourth task is finding an enduring connection with the deceased, your pet in this case, in the midst of embarking on a new life.
Mm.
So remembering your pet that died and leading a full and meaningful life, and keep the treasured memories of you and your pet because they're always available to you. It's a matter of sitting down, reminiscing about the memories, doing some things to remember your pet, like maybe a pet memorial, maybe plant a tree, a garden, tons of things that you can do to remember your pet. You might decide to donate some money to a cause,
Mm.
especially if your pet died from a particular disorder, or in my case, my first dog died from cognitive dysfunction,
Mm.
basically dementia. It happens in dogs too. So you might want to, give some money to some place that's doing research into that to better understand that. Um, so there's many things you can do to honor your pet, and that's really important. And I would suggest for the very first thing you do after your pet has passed is to light a candle in their memory and place it in some place of importance on a little end table, maybe near where you sit. Place a picture of your pet there and have that so you can visually see that. Remember the light that your pet brought into the world and all the wonderful memories that you have of your pet and the impact he made on a lot of
Right.
people. I mean, you don't know. You took your dog for a walk every day. You passed by a neighbor, maybe, and that neighbor came out and just had a ball looking at your dog and maybe, petting him and talking to him. So, all the good that your dog has, dog or cat, whatever pet it is that you have, has done for people in the world.
You know, Anne Marie, I've heard you mention, and you brought it up there in talking about the candle. I've heard you mention that a mistake that people often make um, when interacting with somebody who has lost a pet is to assume that because it's a pet, that the loss and the grieving process will be minimum, less than if it were a human. I've also heard you say that it's a mistake when people advise, well, just get another pet. Are there other mistakes in particular that you find that adults make when communicating with a child about the loss of a pet?
I think one of the biggest mistakes, um, and it's not meant to be, they're doing it on purpose. It's just that they need to be, we all need to be educated more on many things in our lives.
Right.
And so it's kind of, it goes into that category because it's so important to be open and honest with your child. You have to take into consideration their age and their development, what's going on for them. And you're the parent, that you're the best person that can know the answers to that. But it's something that really bugs me is when children are told, "Oh, they just went to sleep."
Mm,
Well, um, they're going to find out that the pet's not going to wake up, and they wake up when they go to sleep.
right.
So they're going to start thinking, "Oh my goodness, maybe I'm not going to wake up," you know, and they may have a hard time going to sleep because they think they're not going to wake up. So it's so important to be open and honest with them. Use death. Use the word death. Use the word dying. Dying. Of course, it's, you got to think about development of your child and their age,
Mm,
but they need to connect what's happening with the pet as being something that's permanent.
hmm.
They're not going to come back, as hard as it is. So I recommend parents, caregivers to read some of these wonderful children's books that are out there on the topic of death. Um, and because that can be like a starting jumping off point where the child might then say, why does that happen? Or, what does that mean? And they're not going to think about it because they're children, and they hear some of these things and they see some of these pictures, and they might start expressing themselves more, where maybe they're pushing it all down, and you want them to bring it out. You want to share your feelings that you're going through, that you miss this pet, and you want to open up the door for your child to do the same.
And I think that's really important to really take into account the age and development of the child who is experiencing this loss of a pet. Because um, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's also the case in particular with young children. And you alluded to this in discussions in your discussion of denial and anger and bargaining. But young children may even blame the death of the pet on themselves. This magical thinking that they somehow, if they had been better, if they had kept their room clean, if they had done X, Y, or Z, the pet wouldn't have died. Have you encountered this?
I have heard of that happening in some cases. I've actually heard that happen a lot when parents divorce or
Mm,
separate, where the child will say, "Well, it's all because of I didn't put my toys away, like you said. Um, I didn't eat my whole plate of food, whatever.
mm,
Um, I, I got I got angry and I kicked and I broke something." So they blame themselves. I think in a similar situation like a divorce, which is an ending of a relationship, and they've lost the relationship of their pet, and they could be thinking, "Oh, it's all my fault. Maybe if I had played with them more, maybe if I didn't give them that piece of candy that I snuck in their
right.
mouth, they wouldn't have died." And maybe that was like something they did like so long ago,
Mm.
but they still have that in their mind.
Do you have other tips? I mean, I really like your idea of creating that special place in memory of the pet with the candle, with the picture. Do you have other tips for helping to create a healthy pet loss experience for children?
Well, the things that I mentioned about being open and honest are first and foremost,
Hmm.
and then you can get into including them in a discussion of what is happening
Mm,
um, to their pet. If you know, okay, our pet is getting very old and he can't walk very well anymore. Keep them in the light instead of in the dark
mm,
about what is going on with their pet. Include him in it. Um, he's got this, disorder, and it makes him have a lot of pain. And so, um, everything that lives dies at some point,
right.
and our pet is in a lot of pain. So it's about keeping them in the loop of what's going on, being a part of it, especially if the kids are older, because they will then, appreciate being part of the conversation for sure. And then, if the pet, if they are going to decide to euthanize the pet, it's really important to ask them if they want to be there for that process, explain what happens, that it usually can be very peaceful ending to the pet's life. The pet won't be in pain during this process, and you're going to help give him the gift that he's not going to have the pain anymore,
Right.
and so on. So you can include that, and then definitely some type of a ceremony afterwards, to celebrate their life and honor their passing.
I believe, given that you are in fact a grief counselor, I think you agree with me that the another thing that adults can do for children who are experiencing pet loss is to help them access grief counseling. How does grief counseling differ from kind of more traditional counseling, Anne Marie?
Well, there's all different techniques therapists use in counseling, and so it's your question is kind of a loaded question, shall we say, because it really depends on the issue that you're dealing with, what you may do with your clients as far as techniques. So grief is grief. Counseling is counseling, no matter if it's for grief or it's for life transitions
Okay.
or it's for um, some mental health concerns other than the ones I mentioned. Like grief is not a mental health concern; it's a fact of life, but it's not a pathological disorder. But there are some mental health concerns that are. So they would be treated and counseled differently than grief. So it all depends on what you bring to the table on what's going to happen and how it's going to be different. But the main thing is that is similar to all counseling is they have unconditional positive regard for your client
Okay.
and to do active listening with them. So it doesn't matter which counseling you're going for, you should look for those features in a therapist.
And is there a growing body? Are there enough grief counselors that understand the loss of a pet such that we can expect to find these specialized counselors in most communities in the United States, or is it still relatively rare?
Well, I'm through my research, I'm finding that there are some people that have kind of specialized in pet grief and loss, as myself. I do other kinds of therapy as well, but I've really specialized in that more in the last maybe 10 years,
Mm,
and got additional ex- training in it specifically for pet loss. And I also have training as a grief educator. which encompasses any kind of loss.
Mm.
But um, I do believe that it takes a special someone to do pet grief and loss. You really need to have a passion for it. I believe that's my opinion. Um, and you've got to get some additional training in it because there are some, nuances with each kind of loss, whether it's a loss of a parent, a loss of a sibling. There's certain, techniques you might use differently for each of those losses, but and they're all unique in their own way.
I
I don't know if there's I find some many books out on the topic of pet grief and loss, and some of them get into the rainbow bridge, which I have no issues with that. If it brings you some solace and you feel better after reading books on that, that's fine. But if your grief is so much, it may require additional services of a professional in the area. You still can believe in the rainbow bridge, and that's perfectly it's not harmful, but you may need to get into more depth in a group support or individual support for your pet loss.
One of the reasons I asked is because, and I have to make a confession. Um, Understanding loss is and grieving, I know less about than I do, for example, childhood trauma. And when we look at trauma, there has been a tendency in the field to quantify trauma, and that sometimes even encroaches in the work, such that you counsel somebody and you decide, oh, this person's trauma is worse than this other person's trauma, and therefore their reaction and the impact of that trauma should be less, right? And so that is why I'm like curious, or at least I think I'm advocating for making sure that if you're taking a child to a counselor for the loss of because of the loss of a pet, that the counselor understands that the the exactly what the impact of that loss could be. Am I way off base here, or is that right, Anne Marie?
I would say that I would definitely want to go to somebody if I was going for um, wanted to see somebody about the grief I'm experiencing with my pet. That I would want to go to somebody that first has a pet or had a pet in their life, and B, that they do have additional training in pet grief and loss.
Excellent.
That's something personally that I believe. Um, Everybody's different. I mean, therapists know about grief in all the general areas of it, how to go about the grieving process and so on. It's different for everybody, but I think the special ones, like I'm going to highlight, you probably would go to somebody who specializes in trauma if you're dealing with trauma.
Right.
You would probably go to somebody that specializes or at least does a lot of counseling with couples. You probably would go to that person as opposed to somebody who doesn't work with couples a lot because you gain a lot of experience along the road. And you might take additional classes, additional certifications, and so on. So, personally, that would be my criteria. If I lost, I would want them to at least have a pet, have had a pet, and maybe even lost one, and also learn some of the special, I don't know what you want to call them, significant things that people can be affected by more because they lost a pet in particular.
And if you're, and I know that a large part of my audience are counselors, are direct service providers, and if you are a counselor and you are looking to kind of expand and get better at your services, or wanting to get better at helping a child with the loss of a pet, what would be the first step you'd recommend that they take?
I would probably have them. do some research for sure. Um, Looking, maybe they can go to Psychology Today. That's a website, it has a database of therapists on there, um, that pay to be on that database,
Mm.
and they can narrow it down to, they can research therapists that deal more with specific things like grief or trauma, and then I would interview them. I would ask for, a free 15-minute consultation, and a lot of them already do offer that. That's something that I offer, like a free 15-minute consultation, and we meet and we talk about, we see if we're like a match. It's got
Mm.
to be a match. You have to feel comfortable talking with them, and vice. It works both ways. So you decide if that seems like something that's going to work, and after you've asked questions and they've answered them, and then you decide, think about it, maybe interview a few other therapists. So there's nothing wrong with interviewing a therapist. In fact, you really should, and you should keep a notebook and write down some of the your thoughts about it, and if you have additional questions, and then go back and maybe ask that therapist some more. Say, I think I'm really interested in working with you, but I want to get a little more clarification on X, Y, and Z. And if they're open to it, fine. If they're not, maybe look for somebody else right away. That's kind of it could be a red flag. So uh, that's the way I would suggest going about it.
Well, and
Just like you would not just go to some other professional without maybe meeting with them first or talking on the phone with them.
how does like a healthy grieving process change how a child approaches future pets?
Well, I think with any loss, if you don't grieve for it fully and process it, down the road, it may come back to, still be a part of you, and it's an incomplete grieving. So that's why it's so important to grieve each loss separately. If there's multiple losses, which sometimes there is,
Mm.
um, and it's not, you have to, in order for it to be healthy down the road, you have to kind of like get the first one worked out, and feel confident about moving forward. And now you can engage in another relationship. But if you didn't kind of grieve for that fully, that future relationship may, you may be thinking back on the one that you lost, and things may come up that are still not really processed properly, and that may cause, some problems going forward.
Well, Anne Marie, I want to thank you so much for being a guest today, and I also want to thank you for really advocating for this, for advocating for a greater understanding of what the loss of a pet, how that loss of pet impacts humans and children in particular. So, thank you so very much.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.
That was Anne Marie Farage-Smith. More information about Anne Marie and her book is at talkingaboutkids.com. And when you visit talkingaboutkids.com, please let me know what you think about the podcast. The Talking About Kids theme song is by the Senators. For more of their music, go to thesenatorsmusic.com. And remember, kids are young goats and young humans. And the difference is that young goats are easier to manage.